It feels like it's been a while since I've been able to play that intro, so I'm glad that today we could finally go back to that. Happy Wednesday. Thank you all for coming by. Um, Super excited for this stream. Today, our plan is to check out the new Android app architecture guides from the Android dev team. This is super exciting. If you haven't seen this yet, I'll talk a little bit about it before we get started. Um, Let me just switch over. I'll also drop this tweet in the Twitch chat right now. I'll make sure it's in the description of this YouTube video. I have a feeling this is going to be a great discussion. Um, but this was a bit of a surprise. So today, what's it today? No, not today. Yesterday. What is it? Yeah, okay, yesterday, Google tweeted this out that they launched a revamped guide to app architecture. And I thought this was really cool. And shout out to one of you who reached out to me on Twitter and said like it would be good to review these on a live stream, not just to look over the app architecture guides and give my sort of opinion on them, but to compare them with the app that we've been working on. I'm out here real quick though. Started looking into Compose Desktop and all your videos and our online discussion helped a lot. However, the business logic for UI and state is killing me, and there is no view model on desktop. Yeah, that sounds complicated. Um, Interesting. I mean, you could still make like a view model type class. It just wouldn't be like an Android view model, but you could still have that. Be an interesting thing to touch on. We can talk about that tonight as well. But the other part of that, before I forget, was to not just sort of review these guides, but while we do it, kind of do like a comparison between what Google suggests for application architecture and what we've been doing on the task management app that we've been working on. Those of you who are unfamiliar with that, you can type exclamation point GitHub in chat, and you can see a link to that project. And that README has some information about what that is. But let me know if I can help explain what that is. So yeah, that's the premise of today's stream, or at least the first part of it. And then, depending on what time it is when we get done looking at that, I had also really wanted to look at some accessibility stuff, but if we don't get to that, that will definitely be the topic of next week's stream. Um, but there was something else that I wanted to talk about also before we dive in. And I'm actually noticing that like it's right here in front of me. I wanted to sort of provide like a disclaimer before we start this conversation, is that when we talk about architecture patterns, a phrase that comes up a lot that I've been trying to wean out of my vocabulary is the phrase best practices. Because the word best can be very subjective, right? What works for one application might not work for another application. And that's fine, right? That's something we've all grown to accept. There are different solutions for different problems. Um, but at the same time, I think that it's really good that Google is coming out with a sort of opinionated approach by like this, where they're saying, here's what our recommendation is. And of course, if it doesn't fit what you're trying to do, you don't have to do it, but it gives people a sense of guidance. And I think that's really important, and that's something that's really different from what Android has been historically. When I started learning Android development, it was pretty much just like, here you go, here's all the tools you need to build an app, you do the rest of it. And then everyone was like, well, how do I make network requests? How do I manage state? How do I like survive configuration changes? There were all these questions, and Google was always like, oh, just kind of figure it out. But now they're being a lot more opinionated about these things. And of course, you don't have to use those solutions. Um, but they're a really great guide. So I think that's just a disclaimer I wanted to give in the beginning. Like, if you see anything in this conversation that doesn't sit right with you, or you don't feel is like necessary in your application, that's fine. You don't have to use this just because it's Google's recommendation. But it's definitely a great place to start if you don't really have a foundation to work with yet. That was just kind of my thoughts. I wanted to throw that out in the beginning. Um, if you're watching this live on Twitch, let me know in chat as you think about certain things, if you're confused, or if, I'd love to have this conversation about, like, if there's anything in here that's really good or maybe really bad. I've seen, as always on Twitter, these guides are not without controversy. Um, so I'm excited to dive into them and see how I feel, see how Twitch chat feels. And like I said, comparing it to an app that we're already working on, I think that would be really cool to see like how close did we get to what they recommended? What did Google do differently? What did I do differently? How could we learn from that? So again, I'll drop it one more time in case some new folks have jumped in. Here's a link to the tweet. I'm putting a link to the tweet because it's treat this as like your entry point or even this first blog post because they mentioned that they have like 5 pages of architecture guides. Instead of linking you to every one, like we could have one landing page here where we can go find everything. We've already got a comment here. So I've seen a lot of bashing on the guide that it's not the most optimal solution, and like it's a guide to help most of the apps most of the time avoid some of the common pitfalls. Yes, that is what I expect to find as well. Um, there's another thing that I think about very often when we have these architecture-based conversations is as I've moved into the more senior development ranks, and there's that running joke that like a senior developer will tell you the answer to every question is it depends. And that is true. Like, there is truth in that statement. There is never a one size fits all answer. However, the other side of that coin is that it depends is not always a helpful answer because you need to know, well, it depends on what? Or, like, is there something that works most of the time? Or is there something that might have some problems but fixes a lot of them that's, like, good enough? Right? And so I think that's what I expect to find here. There will be portions of this that probably aren't perfect, but to someone who is coming into app development for the first time, maybe they just know the basics of Kotlin language, and now they're thinking, well, how do I structure really large applications that have a lot of features, have a lot of things that I need to scale and grow? And I'm hoping this guide will like be that guide, that roadmap for those people. Um, and another comment from Trax, I hate when companies consider these best practices as a way to reject devs, even if they don't use them in apps. I 100% agree. When I've interviewed, both in my current job and last job, I like to ask people about architecture patterns that they've used. Um, and I'm always very strict on the rubric. We don't reject someone based on what their answer is. We want them to give us a concrete explanation on how that pattern works, and then kind of a bonus point if they can compare it to anything else and talk about the drawbacks. But as long as you can explain how your app is architected and maybe a little bit about why, then that's great. And whatever you decided to do, that's an opinion. I'm not going to reject a candidate. I just want them to know that they can explain a broader architecture of a code base. I think like that's important as well. So all of you who are interviewing, keep that in mind. Um, but here's going to be another hard part to a stream like this is I thought that we could just kind of, I'm not going to read through it line by line because I think that would bore people, but I thought I could skim through it. And what I realized that like that might not work well is because if we look at like the UI page here, we can see on the right-hand sidebar, these pages are very thorough. Like they're notably longer than I even realized. Um, so I don't know if we're gonna walk through these in sort of like every section, but what I think we could do is we'll start at the sort of main page, the architecture guide, where it talks about the different layers. We'll go through those. And then we could do a deep dive into each layer where I might start by looking at the sidebar on the right and talking about each of these topics and kind of going from there. Like, I think I could probably talk off the top of my head about each of these individually, and we'll see how that goes. So, let's start with now this first blog post, and I'll also drop these links as we go so you all can have them. This first one is sort of actually not really the landing page, it's an explanation on why they rebuilt this guide. Um, and they start off by talking about some of the importance of having an architecture pattern. It allows apps to scale, improve quality and robustness, and make it easier to test. And those are a lot of buzzwords, but they're right. Um, and was it in this page? It's not in this page, but they talked in another one about how, and I like to describe architecture patterns like this from the very beginning. You can't put all of your code in the activity or fragment. And I think we all know that, right? You can't have a one file application for a number of reasons, developer friendliness being a big thing. And so then the question is, well, how do I split up these responsibilities? And how you decide to do that, that's effectively what an architecture pattern is. Um, and we can split up responsibilities in a way that helps us scale, help make things easier to test, improving quality. Um, I guess this is another way of defining it. An app architecture defines the boundaries between parts of the app and the responsibilities each part should have. This favors the separation of concerns principle that enables the aforementioned benefits. And there's a comment in here as well. I read some comments where they said domain layer shouldn't depend on the data layer. Um, I saw some stuff about that on Twitter too, and I'm not really sure what that is or what like Google's official explanation was, but we will dive into that. So, um, I think at the end of this point, oh, so they talk a little bit more. They quickly highlight here. Um, each Android app should have at least two layers: the UI layer that displays data on the screen, and a data layer that connects the business logic of your app and exposes application data. They also note here you can add an additional layer called the domain layer to simplify and reuse the interactions between the UI and the data layers. So we'll talk about that as we go, but basically what that looks like is you have something like this. Um, and I think to the person in chat who just said this, I think it was the opposite. I think with this arrow here, Google is suggesting that you have a domain layer which talks to a data layer. And I think I've seen some people on Twitter contest that, and I'm not really sure why. Honestly, like this flow, I understand. You have a UI layer and its responsibility. Yes, today's stream we're talking about app architecture. So Google, let me drop them in chat again. Google is rebranded their guides to application architecture for Android. They just posted them out yesterday. So this is a live review of those patterns that Google is suggesting and kind of giving my feedback. And also, once I get to a point where I've talked about it enough, comparing it to an application we've been working on in this stream so we can see what we've been doing over the last several months and if it's close-ish to what Google recommends or not. Um, but so here are the three layers. And in short, it's basically your UI layer is solely responsible for user interface information. Give me some information, and it knows how to display it on the screen. Give it a list of tasks, it knows how to show a task. Given the state of the login screen, it can render the login screen. Your domain layer, which they list as optional, but I encourage people to use, is where that sort of like business logic happens. Like, what's an example of business logic? Like, oh, I need to fetch all of the available tasks, or I need to mark a task as complete, or maybe I need to validate input. Like, I want to make sure the login credentials are valid. That's the sort of work that would happen in the domain layer. And then the data layer is strictly for storing and receiving information. So, kind of sounds conflicting to what I just said. Like, the data layer can say, oh, I need to fetch all of the available tasks. And I think this is why Google says that depending on the application, a domain layer is optional. Like, if, let's imagine a UI layer to display a list of tasks that the user has to complete. So, correspondingly, further down, we have a data layer that fetches all the incomplete tasks from a database or whatever else. Putting another class in the middle that basically passes that answer through does seem like boilerplate, like, or just like unnecessary code. And that's a valid consideration. We've had this conversation before. We could talk about it more if you want to hear. I think there are reasons for still having a domain layer, but if your domain layer is effectively just a proxy between two things and it's just passing the same information through, then yeah, the domain layer is optional because that's just more code. Um, but this is their general diagram. Also on the link I posted in chat, they've created a cool learning pathway that walks you through all these pages one by one, so you know the order in which you should be reading them. So definitely check that out. And you get a cool badge for your developer profile. Um, Raphael, I'll get to your comment in a second. But one more thing on this note, which also is something we talked about earlier. Um, so the question about are these guides for you, right? And they echoed a lot of what I thought is if you're a beginner, you can begin by understanding the benefits of having an app architecture and follow these recommendations as a first approach to the topic. So this is for people who are just now starting to think about architecture, scalability of their applications, but don't know where to begin. This is a great recommendation. But then they go on to say intermediate and advanced developers can follow these recommendations and customize them to their needs. In fact, our research suggests that most professional developers are already using these best practices. So, again, there's the word that I don't like, but I like that they pointed out that you can follow these recommendations and customize them to your need. So, again, this is not like the holy grail that if you don't build your Android app to these specs, you're a bad developer. That's not true. But this is a great place to get started. Um, uh, Raphael, I think this is about the optional domain layer, saying they were considering adding another paragraph, mentioning the other approach, which is a more classical clean architecture by Uncle Bob approach. I never read that book, and I don't plan to anymore. Um, but yeah, I'd be curious what he has to say about it. Oh, about inverting this arrow. Interesting. Okay. So let's dive into their high level guide first. Um, so what is I don't like I said, I don't want to read every word to y'all. I'm not an audiobook. So I'm really just gonna kind of skim through these titles and look for anything that is important to call out. We've already talked about like some of the importance of architecture patterns, and specifically separation of concerns. And I think this is actually repeating something I said earlier. It's a common mistake to write all your code in an activity or fragment. Right? We don't do that. These are UI-based classes. Um, so we should move everything out of there. Um, they go into their recommended app architecture, which is this layer diagram and the role of each layer. So let's stop here. Let's look at. I'm gonna even go back to the other page because it was a bigger image. Um, so let's talk about this again. So we went over like the importance of each layer, and another word that I was trying to think of how to describe to y'all is like, what is a layer, right? Like this is it's something that I think when you've been talking architecture long enough, it clicks in your head. But people who are new to this, like, what the hell is a layer? Right? Like layer is not a programming word. We never create a class or interface called a layer. So how do we know what this means? Um, and the best thing I could come up with is to think about a layer as one or more related classes that have identical functionality or very similar functionality, like to achieve the same role. And so looking at this diagram here, these three layers, I realized that in a past stream, which I did not get the YouTube video out, I can find it. Hold on. I really should do this. Um, because I think this is important. Hold on. Um, I will make sure to put this in the YouTube video, but just for people who are watching. So, in a recent stream a while back, a couple months ago actually, we did a documentation of our project. And part of that was documenting the application architecture of the TOA application we've been working on. And we came up with this. And let me zoom in a little bit in case you can't see all those words. Um, but what this is basically exactly what we saw earlier, just with real names behind it. So you can think of our UI layer as like the collection of the login screen, and the login view model. And the way they interact with each other is the login view model emits this view state. It's a state flow behind the scenes. And then the screen will update the view model with UI events, like text change, button clicks, things like that. This is our UI layer. And it has a dependency on a domain layer, which other people will use the term use cases. So we'll have a string of one or more use cases that do some business logic. In this case, we have one that logs the user in, and that's the business logic. Given the username and password, I want to be able to log them in. This is our domain layer. And then that goes up a step further to our data layer, which actually does any sort of data manipulation or storage. So here, it has a login repository, which says, given a username and password, like, give me an authentication token. It reaches out to a server, gets an authentication token. And then we have this token repository where we will store that token for future reference, like so we can persist it throughout the app. Um, and that's our app specifically, but I already feel like we're off to a good start. Google says, hey, you should have these three layers, pulling up our architecture pattern from design from a previous stream. Our app has three layers: the UI layer, the domain layer, and the data layer. So we're actually already off to a good start in what we're working on. Um, but I was hoping that um, I'm curious if this guide really talks about why these three layers are so good. Um, let's see if they talk about that. So this page talks about each one a little more in depth. Um, this is another this is actually really great. This is identical to what I just said, and I love it. So they point out the UI layer could have two things in it. It could have your UI elements, which is like the screen or the views, and then it talks to stakeholders, such as view model classes. So, all right, we're already like running off with flying colors. Our UI layer is exactly the way they recommend. And also, like I said, just repeating myself in the beginning, this is a recommendation. If your class doesn't look like this, don't take it personally. Don't feel like your app is necessarily poorly architected. Um, but there is definitely reasons behind why this guide is written the way it is, so it's nice to know that we're pretty close to that. Um, the domain layer can have like a collection of repositories and data sources. So the differentiator between these two is like, think about a data source as something very specific, like a database or a remote server. And then a repository is something that sort of like combines data from one or more of those data sources. Um, do they talk about that? Um, yeah, like here. So repository classes are responsible for exposing data, centralizing data changes, resolving conflicts between multiple data sources, um, abstracting the source of data from the rest of the app, containing business logic. This bullet point feels controversial to me. This is my like first one that I think is controversial. Um, Typically, I would say that your data layer um, should not do any business logic or data manipulation. It should take some input, give you some output. Maybe it maps from one class to another, like a network object to like a more app-friendly Kotlin object or something. Like that's fine, but I typically wouldn't say that your repository should have business logic. So I'm not sure what they mean by that. Um, and all right, let's see what Google has to say about this optional domain layer. So the domain layer is an optional layer that sits between UI and data. It's responsible for encapsulating complex business logic or simple business logic that is reused by multiple view models. This layer is optional because not all apps will have these requirements. You should use it only when needed, for example, to handle complexity or favor reusability. Okay, This is a really good discussion we can have. Oh, but another one here. I had an interesting discussion about what is business logic before. Like, if you need to retry an API call, where would you do it? And is that considered business logic? It's a really good question. Yes, we're reading the new Arc Docs. Welcome back, WebShark. Um, so I think retry does kind of seem like a business logic, right? Because you don't have to retry. That seems like a product decision. Um, so it seems like you would manage when and how often you retry, and all of a sudden that is logic specific. That is your app's business logic. Um, could you put that retry functionality right inside the repository in the data layer? I guess that's not the worst scenario. That's not the worst decision. Um, no, I guess that's not the worst decision. Um, but it ties into like this point. This is I'm gonna read this again. Um, I'm gonna read this paragraph again because I think this is really good for everyone to think about. The domain Hi Prince. The domain layer is responsible for encapsulating complex business logic or simple business logic that is reused by multiple view models. This layer is optional because not all apps will have these requirements. You should use it only when needed, for example, to handle complexity or favor reusability. Um, so, um, so I'm trying to think of like um, what's an example where I'm trying to think of an example where I might not want to have a domain layer, but business logic that could put in like a data layer. Ooh, another question here. Consider a library that collects and holds historical data and syncs it with a local database for faster loading. In my view, this should all be data layer, and the complex things, talking to web and storing caching data, is business logic. The domain layer is a layer that transforms the data so that the UI can later display it. Um, that's valid. Um, I think that that's one way to do it. Okay, so all right, so let me pitch a hypothetical example here. Um, let's say I have an API endpoint. Let's say hypothetically that my API is poorly designed. Let's say I have like an API endpoint that fetches all of the tasks a user has ever put in their to-do list. But I have a screen that only wants to show the incomplete tasks. So I'm going to have a call to fetch all the tasks, and then I'm going to have like a filter function that says filter for incomplete. Would you put that filter function right inside your domain layer or your data layer, like inside the repository? Or would you have like a fetch tasks use case that gets all tasks and then filters them inside the domain layer? Where does that go? And I think Google is saying that like that's kind of up to you on whether or not you consider that filtering. Like, is it like complex filtering that maybe you are keeping your repository layer smaller by moving it into a new class? Or maybe it's reusability, like multiple classes are filtering, so you might want to put that filtering in its own domain layer. Um, Good point. Um, oh, and Raphael brings up another good point is that um, retries in the domain layer implies that API calls happen. That's an interesting point. Um, so I wonder. So okay, let's keep going with that thought. Think about the filtering one because I think that's an example where yeah, filtering is an example of data manipulation. So where does that go? Like, and it's very easy to be like, well, a filter call is like a one-liner in Kotlin. So if I put a filter call right in my repository, is it the end of the world? Probably not. But should I? Like, is that the right thing to do in principle? Is the question. But what we can do is we can keep going and see if they give an example of something that could go in a domain layer. And here's one. So classes in this layer are commonly called use cases or interactors. Each use case should have a responsibility over a single functionality. For example, your app could have a get time zone use case class if multiple view models rely on time zones to display the proper message on the screen. Okay, so that does make sense to me. Um, Again, sort of thinking in principle, assuming that we're not just going to make a date util singleton. Um, but like, I guess that's the same idea, right? Is you could have a use case for an individual piece of functionality that might exist in multiple screens. Um, hmm, okay, I think this makes sense. Um, but then it begs the question, like, so let's go back to our architecture example of like this sort of login use case. Um, If you write map for Git, then filtering the logs, for instance, is already part of the core business logic, so it would be part of the data layer, and you can only prepare the data in the domain layer for viewing. Hmm. Okay, I can see that as a good point. So some apps use this concept of I didn't do this in the TOA app yet, but some apps have this concept of like a I like to call them display models. Like you could have um okay, let's look at some code and let me show you an example of let me just open up a random file and let's talk about like how I might do this. So or actually yes, let's look at this. So we have a task entity here. Let's imagine that our task entity also had like a scheduled date. And um thank you for the follow. I am a ASDF. I was like trying to pronounce that, and then I realized that's the keyboard letters like in a row on a QWERTY keyboard. Um, okay, but let's talk about this. So we could have a task. This is like our sort of domain model, and maybe this is the wrong way to put it, um, that defines all the information that a task could be. But when it comes to displaying this on the UI, you know, I don't, I can't display a local date. Usually I display like a formatted string. So what? Holy crap. What? What did I do to deserve that? Thank you for the 20 gifted subs. Holy crap. Everyone say thank you to Hallie Rootin if you got gifted a sub. You should all have like chat emotes now. So you can all spam the Wednesday frog. Um, wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And I see a lot of you have gingerbread emotes. I need to continue going with the sub emotes. Holy crap, thank you so much. Um, that is one way to make me lose my train of thought. Oh my god. I'm not going to read out all the names, but it looks like a lot of y'all regulars just got gifted a sub. Uh, so thank you again. Even without a hot tub. Well, that means a lot. Uh, okay, so I wanted to finish this thought on like making information presentable and thinking about like so I have a task. This defines all the, and I'm just going to put a default here, by the way, so it doesn't like break compilation anywhere. But I have a task, and this is all the primitive data types of what a task could be. And now, potential process that apps might go through is, well, um, okay, we have a task list item, and it consumes a task. And I think people would say that this is actually wrong that you should have like a separate model that takes everything and presents it in a UI friendly way. And what they mean by that is like we could have a task display model. That's what I like to call them. And it will have like a description, which is still a string, but then here, like the scheduled date would be a string. And we could note here, scheduled date is a user-friendly representation of the task's um, scheduled date. So, all right, so yeah, CPs these two. I really like this concept. Um, yeah, I've seen presentation. I've also seen people love to call them like view models. It's a model for the view, but then people didn't like that it clashed with the architecture component view model and like the concept of a view model. So um, I don't remember where I was that I saw the name display model or if I came up with it, but that's what I use. So then the question would be like, so um, why not add an extra getter that returns a nice string for display? Um, that's a good question. Um, uh, I don't know how to answer that. Because I think that like there's a little bit of a well, we could add the getter right on the data class. We could be like user-friendly date string. We could just like return something here. Um, and then inside my UI, I could just call task.userFriendly date. And I think the argument is like in the principle of keeping your data class super clean. And kind of what CP says, like this is the information about what a task is. It does not care like how it's being stored. It does not care how it's being displayed. This is just all the information relevant to a task. So apps I've seen, it sounds like overkill at first, but I've seen you typically can have like three models, three classes for the same entity, and they actually end up mapping to those like three layers. You could have a task, which is like your domain layer, like this is the base information for a task. You could have a task DTO, which is like information for sending and receiving the task from a network or a room database. And then you could have your task display model, which is how you display it on the UI. Um, so then I think I forgot who was uh yeah, and Hallie brings up another good point. Like I could have a task, if this had a lot of fields, I could have like a task detail display model. And then I could also have like task summary display model. But in either case, they're generated from the same task entity. Um, but so what I'm thinking is someone said, the use case is about presenting information. So uh, I'm going to rename this to just task display model for now. But so we have this get all tasks use case, which returns a list of tasks. So the question being, if we were to rethink about how this is architected, would our use case return, because the use case goes to the UI layer, would it return a display model instead of a task? Would this be the right way to do it? And then I don't really care what business logic the domain layer might be or the data layer might be doing. I just know that when I do get back a list of tasks, um, I need to map it to the UI. Um, and I've seen this done differently. I've seen like I don't typically do this. Me personally, I will have this return like a task, and then maybe in like my view model, I would do the mapping from a task to a display model. But I guess that's like, that's up for debate. Maybe this should go inside of, um, for different screens, you can need to have different display models. Yeah, you're right. Um, That's a good point too. Um, but would you have? Yeah, and I guess that's why these questions. I'm gonna say it. I guess that's why it depends. Because my counterpoint would be, well, if I have different display models, are they the same use case? But I guess the answer to that could be yes, right? Like I could have, um, right, it does. Uh, but I think Raphael is onto something in that it's whether or not you intend to reuse the use case. So if I have this one to get all tasks, and on one screen I'm showing um, incomplete tasks, and on another screen I'm showing completed tasks. Um, well, I should probably have different use cases for that. So what's an example? I don't know, but maybe you're right. Maybe there are two different screens where I present tasks differently, but I want to reuse that logic. You're right. Then it makes sense for that screen to do the UI mapping necessary. If you reference the onion image of the architecture, you can see that everything depends on the domain. So it makes sense to map it to the view model presentation. Hmm. Yeah. Um, so I guess that could go either way. Um, but I was just curious where we would put that. So if I didn't do this, by the way, um, but inside task list item, if I instead had this consume a display model, um, then what I would do is whereas like task list, I would also do it here. Um, a separate mapper class? I don't do that. Um, so I guess what I would have done if I was doing this is like we have like a task list view state. Um, where I guess what I would do is this would be a list of like task display model. That makes sense. This is a UI state. It should have a display model. And then so what we would do is like inside the task list view model. Whoops, not there. Inside the view model class, this is where I would typically do it. And then we would do like IT.2 display model. This is how I like to write them. Um, and of course, this doesn't exist, but um, that's kind of how I would do it. Uh, we can see later on if they explain that. Because I feel like we could really debate this. I kind of want to. I kind of want to keep writing code. Actually, let's do a reset here. Um, and let's check out a new branch, and let's talk through it. So, um, task list item presentation. So let's start with what we know we want to do. Is that we want to. This is a task list UI item. Uh, and again, not really thinking about like complete, incomplete stuff. I'm going to call this a task display model. Um, and then we could put like, I feel like I need to put like a date in here for us to understand why this class is actually helpful. Because if I have two data classes that have the exact same properties, like then it just feels like I'm duplicating code, which I am, but there's a reason. So let's put like a scheduled date. Um, yeah. Um, yeah, so let's call this like task summary. We'll call this one task summary display panel. So creates a user-friendly representation of a task. We're going to import this in a second. It shows a brief summary of what needs to be done. Okay, and then this might be controversial, but instead of a mapper class, in the file where I define my display model, I make extension functions. And I do like pass that to summary display model. Um, so, but this does bring a interesting problem here, which is like, so description will just be this, that description. Scheduled date, I'm going to put an empty string for right now. Hold on one sec. This will actually lead to an interesting conversation. Sorry for the detour from the architecture docs. It's not really a detour. We're deep diving into one of the specific layers. Um, but let's go back to our task, scheduled date. And we'll just say local date. This will be local date dot now. Okay, so this is another thing is like, well, the thing about testability here, if I want to test this, like I could put my date formatter right inside this function, but it's not necessarily always going to be testable because like dates are not usually fun to test because I don't know how a date's going to be formatted. I don't. One time I got bit because the locale of the machine my test was running on wasn't the English locale, so that broke a date formatting test. But I guess putting that aside, we could be like, um, you know, friendly date pattern. This could be something like month, day, year. And then, so friendly date formatter would be like date time formatter dot of pattern, friendly date pattern. And so our scheduled date could be like friendly date formatter dot format this dot scheduled date. Yeah, okay, it's not great, but um it's fine for now. So we've defined our task, we've defined our display model. So now the question is, where do I call this to summary display model? Well, the first thing we can fix is like, um, let's start by updating the UI, right? So task list, I guess I should call this like summary list. Um, but let's just put it in here. It'll be like a task summary display model. Ooh, okay. I'm actually, this is going to be more good discussion. Um, because I kind of want to go back to the docs to try to understand what they do because this actually gets a little grittier. Because not only in this case, so I can start by, doing the display models inside the list item and the preview breaks. So we're just going to call this. Um, and the preview breaks here. But I want to talk about like this line right here. So on this task summary listing, we have a callback to say, hey, this task was clicked, or we're rescheduling it. And this has like a task callback. But this leads to another sort of fundamental conversation like, what, how do we handle this? I can satisfy the compiler by doing like summary display model. But then let's think back to our view model where like, oh, we don't even have it here. But imagine our view model has like a method that says, hey, we want to reschedule this task. So then I would need to go to the domain layer and say, hey, reschedule this task and propagate that up. But imagine I need, in my application, I would need like a unique identifier for the task that I want to reschedule. That's the point I'm getting at. And now, with this, like, where do I define that? Um, you know what I mean? because if my callback is a display model, well, sure, I could like, I could just be like task ID right on here, but should the display model have a task ID? That doesn't seem correct because it's a UI model. But on the other hand, I guess I do need a way to go from the UI model back. Um, so, so you think this is correct that it should be in here, even if it, even if it's a property that's never displayed to the user, that it should be in here? Uh, okay, so I'm actually, yeah. So then, basically, what I could do from there is like in the view model, then we would have like task summary rescheduled clicked. Um, and then so here we would basically do something like reschedule task use case dot invoke task dot task ID. Obviously, this doesn't compile because that doesn't exist. Um, there are rules that are meant to be broken. You're right. IDs can be useful for generating keys in like a recycler view or a lazy column. You're right. Um, interesting. Okay. Okay. I could see that as a valid thing. But that aside, click listeners aside, um, we've still got the next question, which is where does the display model get created? And it sounds like we had two ideas. One, we could have the get all task use case return this, but let's say, for sake of example, like Raphael mentioned, maybe that's not true. Maybe we have different spots in the app where we request all of your tasks. So it's just for this particular screen that we would do it. So I guess would it make sense to do it in, we could have our view state expect these display models. And then, so I guess what would happen is our view model would do some logic here. And so basically we're saying if we're success, we would do display models will be result.data.map it2.2 summary display model, get task result. And then we would say, our view state is this. Um, and I think based on the architecture guides, at first I thought this might not be the best solution. Um, but in hindsight, this does make sense in principle. This is part of the UI layer. It's taking information from the main layer and mapping it into our view state, which gets passed to the UI, and the UI knows, given a list of display models, what to do with it. I think that makes sense. Okay, I like this. For sake of consistency, I'm just going to call this task display model. I know that it might bite me later in the application, but until the point where we have like different list of tasks, um, I'm just going to leave it at that. Uh, yeah, so that's another point. So there's only one display right now, okay? So that's another good point. So let's commit this real quick. Um, hopefully this passes. Creating task display model. And so if we can, um, so I would say that wasn't a detour. That was a practical guide to understand the domain layer. But yeah, now we're all stuck on the date. Where does the date formatting live? Um, and so, uh, So, well, I guess for this particular case, um, where did it go? For this particular case, this wouldn't change based on locale. Or like maybe it technically would, but like we're not doing conditional logic here. So I could write a unit test for this that if I'm supplying the date, it's going to return correctly 100% of the time. But if I wanted to do something fancy, like have this return like today, tomorrow, or the date, this gets a lot more complicated. And I don't think that's for today's stream. So, you know, should I put a datetime formatter here? Probably not. What I would do is like I would put like I would pass in like a datetime helper. And then what I would do is I would do like um datetime helper dot get relative day string. And then I would pass, this dot scheduled date. That's how I would do this. Um, I usually always have a date extensions file that has a bunch of extension functions to convert date types to format strings. Yeah, exactly. But I'm just saying I would like inject that here. And the reason for injecting it is because then in my tests, I can mock a datetime helper that like always returns what I want it to return. So I never have to worry about like the actual locale that's running my test or the actual date and time that my tests are running. Um, so, but that is a stream for another day. So let's thank you for indulging me on that trip through um, the domain layer and how it relates to like presenting logic. So I think our conversation there was that your use case sounds like the answer was it depends. You could have a use case that returns your display models, but if you think your use case is going to be reused in a few spots, then it should just return your base domain model, and then the corresponding view model for the screen will take that data and figure out how to present it. Um, and I think that's probably something I would always do, um, just to sort of cover my ass. Because if I put a display model in here and then I need like a similar use case that's got a slightly different return type, then that's kind of annoying. Um, so that's a really good suggestion. Oh, sorry, I'm dropping stuff. Um, but depends driven development. Yep. Uh, so let's see what else we've got. uh, we should send that to Sam Edwards. He would love that. Um, you can even compose use cases. So like other use case can fetch tasks. Yeah, yeah, you can definitely do that. I actually think we didn't we do that? Oh, we didn't. We had our login had multiple repositories. But yeah, you could have like multiple use cases together. So let's keep going on their docs. So now that we understand the three layers, it sounds like they've got two more points here. Managing dependencies between components, and I am going to call this general suggestions. I'm going to try to. Ooh, I should write a Chrome extension that replaces the word best practices with suggestions. I'm going to do it. Anyways, so what are their notes on here? Um, they talk about dependency injection, which allows classes to define their dependencies without constructing them. Uh, service locator, that's basically another way of looking at dependency injection. Um, so they talk about Hilt. We've already done streams on that. Basically, they're just saying like, how do you manage? So if you have a view model that depends. Hi, Illustrator. Thanks for coming by. If you have a view model that depends on a use case, how do you supply that use case to the view model? Jens, thank you for the subscription. Oh my God, so many subscriptions tonight. You are all amazing. I really appreciate it. Um, we could talk more about dependency injection if someone wants, but again, the TLDR is it's just your view model has a use case. How do you make sure you provide that use case? There's a lot of different ways to do it. We use the HILT library, which Google also recommends. There's a lot of other tooling out there. It's just something important to think about. Let's see what their general suggestions are. And I think we'll see how these are good. So, although the following recommendations aren't mandatory, in most cases, following them makes your code more robust, testable, and maintainable in the long run. So, see what all their suggestions are. So, don't store data in app components. Avoid designating your app's entry points, such as activities, services, or broadcast receivers, as sources of data. Instead, they should only coordinate with other components to retrieve the subset of data that is relevant to that entry point. Each app component is rather short lived, depending on the user's interaction with their device and the overall current health of the system. So I think what they're trying to say here is like, if I have a list of tasks, I don't want to store that inside like the task list activity. Like, I don't want that to be my source of truth because based on, the user's interaction with their device, if they like close the app, then I lose all of that information. How do we fix that? Like, I guess that depends on how long you want to store the data, but I think this is a good general suggestion. Like, be mindful of where your source of truth is, which should not be inside like your UI layer. You should have a source of truth somewhere else. Um, Reduce dependencies on Android classes. So your app components should be the only classes that rely on Android Framework SDK APIs, such as Context or Toast. Abstracting other classes in your app away from them helps with testability and reduces coupling within your app. So this bullet point, this is spot on for me. Again, like this comes up as someone's best practice because like 9 times out of 10 you don't want to reference the system. And I actually think about that. Like, is this a nod towards multi-platform code? It may be. If you can write code that's not dependent on the Android framework and you're using Kotlin, it's then very easy to port that piece of code over to a multi-platform application. And I think that it's possible they're nodding to KMM, but if they're not, I still think this is important because of the fact that like the Android system can't run on a standard JVM unit test. So if I have a class that consumes a context and I want to write a unit test for that, I can't. Not without using something like Roboelectric or Annoying Mocking. So it's, can you use interfaces or some other way to present that something needs to be done so that in your tests you're not relying on the Android framework. And I think that's what they would say here. Oh, coupling links to Wikipedia, but that's a good point about coupling. Um, so yeah, exactly. So the pure JVM tests run faster, so it's really great to not rely on Android in those scenarios. Um, what's another one? What about dependency injection? Um, Read this next one. Create well-defined boundaries of responsibility between various modules in your app. For example, don't spread the code that loads data from multiple network sources from the network, or wait, don't spread the code that loads data from the network across multiple classes or packages in your codebase. Similarly, don't define multiple unrelated responsibilities, such as data caching and data binding, in the same class. I think this is a good recommendation. I think that kind of makes sense. Um, yes, in short, yes. Uh, Dependency injection is a way to um, avoid like system references. Trying to think of an example. Um, Another way, if you're not injecting something. Okay, so let's imagine. Let's imagine I want to deal with navigation, and I have a view model that, um, given a UI event, needs to determine where to navigate. A couple solutions that people might see is you could create like a navigator interface that you inject into the view model, and then your view model could be like navigator.navigate here. Another way is you could have like a flow that your view model exposes. And let's say your view model exposes like a route string. And then what would happen is the view would basically listen to that and then call like fragment dot replace with whatever information. So I guess there's two ways. You could either, depending on what it is, you could have something injected into the view model, or you use like a flow or some sort of observable concept so that your view model exposes the information um, for the view to deal with. Um, those are kind of the two approaches I would do with something like that. Um, I kind of like this thought. I wish they had a specific example. Expose as little as possible from each module. For example, don't be tempted to create a shortcut that exposes an internal implementation detail from a module. You might gain a bit of time in the short term, but you are then likely to incur technical debt many times over as your codebase evolves. So I think this point right here could be related back to our discussion about display models. So in our contrived example, we had a task with two properties. We had a display model with two properties. And that felt like a lot of code when we could just put a getter right on the domain model. But I think that we could see as our code base evolves, and maybe as the properties of a task grow, uh, it can be kind of tricky having both presentation and domain logic in the same file. So it's good to think like only expose the domain information from that class, only expose UI information from the display model. Like keep those things separate. Even if you think you're gaining time in the short term by not using that, that kind of pattern stands out. So I think that's um I wish they gave a specific example, but I think that's what they're trying to hint at is like and that's something you really only understand by building apps enough time that you understand like what you have trouble like scaling, and then once you've been bit by it, you won't do it again. Um, Sometimes you just have to live and learn now. Um, what's this? Focus on the unique core of your apps that stands out. This seems like they just wanted to plug Jetpack. It says don't reinvent the wheel by writing the same boilerplate code again and again. Instead, focus your time and energy on what makes your app unique and let the Jetpack libraries and other recommended libraries handle the repetitive boilerplate. This just this doesn't seem like an architecture point to me. I think they just needed an excuse to plug the Jetpack libraries. um, I know that's like kind of critical, but this doesn't seem like a yeah. Um, yeah, I think the way your compose destinations idea works, and the way like a navigator is an interface that I could make a custom navigator that I pass into tests, and so in my tests I don't actually have a reference to the system. That's a good thing. Um, Consider how to make each part of your app testable in isolation. That's a given. That's kind of for example, having a well-defined API for fetching data from the network makes it easier to test the module that persists that data in a local database. If instead you mix the logic from these two modules in one place, or distribute your networking code across your entire code base, it becomes much more difficult. Yeah, I think this is something you get out of the box if you kind of follow these layers. Um, their examples more specific on like don't have a class that's like making API calls and database calls at the same time, at least not directly. Um, Make it so that API is in its own class, database is in its own class. If you have a class that mediates those two, then hopefully you're using like interfaces so you can like mock those two sources. And then persist is much relevant and fresh data. This also doesn't seem this seems like an Android recommendation that's also not an architecture point. Like, that way users can enjoy your app's functionality even when their device is in offline mode. Like, yeah, no, none of this has to do with architecture. This is a good suggestion. Yes, I encourage people to follow this. Same with the Jetpack libraries, but that doesn't seem like a the architecture. And they have some samples of architecture patterns. So that's the docs. That's my review. So let's pause before we look at any of those pages and deep dives. What are my overall thoughts on this? Not that anyone really cares. It's not a podcast, but my opinion on this. I think these are good. I think like if you take it with a grain of salt, like we said in the beginning, that um, this is largely a recommendation. Um, yeah, there's a lot more on each layer, which we can dive into. But I think it's a good point to like understand their high level guide to app architecture. And I think that from a high level standpoint and what they've suggested as three layers, I think this is really good. Um, and the reason I think that, well, like very clearly explained, I think in a lot of cases, I didn't really like this section. First of all, I hate the name. We've been over that, but I'd really like. I just feel like these weren't very explicit. Um, but when we talk about like if we consider some of these recommendations here, right? Reduce dependencies on Android classes. If you follow the three layers from earlier in the post, this just kind of happens implicitly because it should be that your UI layer is the fragment or activity or compose view, right? And then these domain layers, these are things you write yourself. So they're already decoupled from the Android framework. Now, there's a lot of nuance there. Like, you also shouldn't tightly couple yourself to retrofit in your third party libraries and stuff. But um, you can, hopefully, that explains like how if you are thinking about how to separate the functionality in your code base, you're already following that separation of concerns. That's going to make your code testable, make dependency injection easier, reduce dependencies on Android classes, um, making things testable. Uh, Following those layers gets you really close. And there's nuance to each one. Again, there's a conversation on dependency injection. There's the importance of interfaces. They talked about uh, Urson, thank you for the follow. Uh, when they talked about the domain layer and how this references like use cases or interactors on this, yes, of course, if you go through them all, you'll get a badge. They don't really talk about how, like, well, at least my opinion, if you make a use case, it should be an interface. Your view model should consume a use case interface. And the reason for that is for testing and making it so that I can easily, but also dependency injection, making it easy to swap out a use case implementation. And maybe on the domain layer page they talk about that, but like that's sort of the deeper dive. But this is a heck of a start. And I think, again, I know a lot of people who follow me are kind of like seasoned or have done some Android development. Um, I know over on YouTube, shout out to all my YouTube folks, uh, people of all skill levels are watching this. So I think this is a great starting point for a lot of people. Um, and even as someone who's been doing Android dev for a while, it was nice to see that this maps pretty close to our application already. But there was that whole like 15-20 minute discussion on the domain layer and the presentation logic. So it's really cool that this can even take people who have been doing Android for a while and get us to think about how we've been doing things and if we could do them better. So that was a mouthful, but we can keep going. And so, well, what do we want to do? So there's more pages, um, which are so there's pages for each of the layers, a deep dive into UI, data, and domain layer. But there's also one on UI events. And me personally, I would love to look at this because I think if I were to look at UI and data layer and domain layer, we're going to see kind of what we've already done, but maybe just like a little more specific about what goes on in each of these layers. And if anyone in chat wants to look at one in particular, we can. Like I said, if we have time, we could look at them all. But I think this page on UI events would be interesting because this is a really common concern for Android. Like, um, if the UI does stuff, like if I click a button and I need to tell the view model or text changes or checkbox changes, like how do I pass that off to update state and like how do I handle navigation and like that seems like it's just always a tough conversation. So I think it's really exciting that Google's kind of um, giving us guidance on this. It's not a solved problem, like you said. So let's look at this all together. Let me drop it in chat. Um, but okay, so this page I might actually read out. So we all understand the same page. So UI events are actions that should be handled in the UI layer, either by the UI or by the view model. The most common types of events are user events. The user produces user events by interacting with the app, for example, tapping the screen or generating gestures. The UI then consumes these events using callbacks such as on-click listeners. Yes, I think without getting further down the page, I'm hoping that that's what it's about. It's like, how do you uh, deal with like telling the UI to update stuff? And actually, so we can see this on the side. They point out two things. There's handling user events, so like user events and recycler views. They have some naming conventions. That's exciting. And then the other side is what Raphael just said, handling view model events. So how do we consume events that can trigger state updates? So how do I show a toast? How do I navigate? How do I don't know, trigger vibration? You know, what is an event that could come from the view model that modifies the UI and like that system layer? And that's what we'll get down here. But let's start at the top. So they also point out some key terms here. So UI refers to the view-based or composed code that handles the user interface. UI events are actions that should be handled in the UI layer. Okay, so I think an example of a UI event could be like showing a toast. And then user events are events that the user produces when interacting with the app. So a user event is like a button click, a text change, checkbox changed. Um, you're right. Maybe they are. We shall see. So we got a lot of words here. Let's just read it all. I would like to read it all, mostly for me. So the view model is normally responsible for handling the business logic of a particular user event. For example, the user clicking on a button to refresh some data. Usually, the view model handles this by exposing functions that the UI can call. User events might also have UI behavior logic that the UI can handle directly. For example, navigating to a different screen or showing a snack bar. So I think this is, and I'll blow this up while we are reading it so it's a little easier. I lose the sidebar, but wait, can I hide that? Ooh, nice. Okay. All right. I lost the sidebar, but now that we know the topics we're going to cover, I can blow this up so y'all can read it on here with me. Um, I think this started really good, and I think this paragraph kind of confused me. So the first part, we do this in our application. The view model handles this by exposing functions that the UI can call. Let me show you a code example of that exact thing. So inside our login screen, we have a login content, which renders the screen. And notice it has methods on it, like email changed. That calls viewModel.email changed. And if we look at this function signature, it's just a function that consumes a string. So that's that idea. Your view triggers some event, you take the output of that event, and you pass it off to the view model. So we already do that. But then it says, user events might also have UI behavior logic that the UI can handle directly. For example, navigating to a different screen or showing a snack bar. So I think this is controversial. Like, consider you have a button that navigates to a screen. Where does that logic go? And this is that unsolved problem. Like, is the right thing to do to tell the view model, hey, the user click this button, and then the view model then tells the view, hey, you need to navigate here. That's how I like to do things, because that's a sort of unidirectional data flow, and then the view is not doing responsibility that no one else knows about, right? Um, Even if like the button always navigates there. This is that shortcut thing. The button may always navigate there in your app, but um, maybe you have a button that navigates to two different places based on the state. The conditional logic doesn't belong in the view; it belongs in like the view model or even further up. Um, so I don't really like this. I don't think your UI should be, maybe a snack bar, depending on like if you click a certain button, but in general, I don't like this. But let's see if they correct that. So, um, while the business logic remains the same for the same app on different mobile platforms or form factors, the UI behavior logic is an implementation detail that might differ between those cases. The UI layer page defines these types of logic as follows. Business logic refers to what to do with state changes, for example, making a payment or storing preferences. The domain and data layers usually handle this logic. Okay, we talked about that. And then UI behavior logic refers to how to display date changes, or state changes, which we talked about. For example, navigation logic or how to show messages to the user. The UI handles this logic. Yeah, not clear. Maybe it gets more clear. And they point this out again. These can be applied to a broad spectrum of apps to allow them to scale, blah, blah. However, you should treat them as guidelines and adapt them to your requirements as needed. Okay, so let's look at this UI event decision tree. The following diagram shows the decision tree to find the best approach for handling a particular event use case. The rest of this guide explains these approaches in detail. So I might need to zoom out briefly to see this. Okay, so the event originates in one of two places, either in the UI or in the view model. If it's in the view model, that means we need to update the UI state. So an example of this, I think, is like, um, I don't know, like maybe like the user starts logging in, so we need to update the UI state to show a loading indicator. That's what this would do. I still don't understand, like, for an example of like the view model wanting to navigate, that's not updating the UI state, or is it? I mean, I guess kind of like, but oh, let's talk about this. So, and then when it's in the UI, they point this out. So, if the event requires business logic, delegate to the view model. But if it requires UI behavior logic, modify the UElement state in the UI directly. So, I think what they're suggesting is like, if you know a button's always going to navigate to the same place, just do it in the UI here. But if clicking a button can lead to multiple different user flows, then you should delegate that to the view model. I think my controversial take is like I've been burned by this block right here so many times that I just shove everything to the view model. Um, yeah, like I get what they're saying that like that's a lot of work for something that eventually just goes full circle, but um, yeah, okay. WebCheck says the same thing. Like I never do this. Um, I just never do this. Okay, let's see. Oh, so the UI. Let's talk about user events here. So user events we said are like button clicks, gestures, things like that. This is what we're about to dive into. The UI can handle user events directly if those events relate to modifying the state of a UI element. For example, the state of an expandable item. Um, If the event requires performing business logic, such as refreshing the data on the screen, it should be processed by the view model. The following example shows how different buttons are used to expand a UI element, UI logic, and to refresh data on the screen, business logic. So this is a good, what is UI business logic? So let's scroll back up. They explain this. Business logic refers to like what should happen if we need to save or store something or refresh data. UI logic just refers to what is displayed. So how do I display something? And they actually touch on a good example right here of something that is UI logic, which is like the expanded state of an element. Like if I have a list of items and tapping on it shows me some detail. Um, that is kind of like UI logic. Is this expanded or is this not? Now, I typically still end up going through the view model for stuff like this, but I think they're saying that is expanded is like, I'm going to guess. Actually, I'm not going to guess. Let's look at their code. And let's see. Okay. So the following example shows how different buttons are used to expand the UI element and to refresh data on the screen. Except I don't know. Okay, so in the news app composable, something they do is on profile clicked, they just call navigator.navigate. So that's something we talked about earlier. I typically don't do this, but I guess they're saying if clicking on this is always just going to navigate and do a UI thing, then you can just leave it there. But if the action needs to modify a state, you have to think where that source of state comes from and do the action there. Yeah, that makes sense. So this would be a UI logic here. But this would be business logic saying the refresh event is processed by the view model that is in charge of the UI's business logic. So here we have a refresh button that calls viewModel.refresh news. So that will trigger a state change with the refresh data. So that is business logic. Refreshing is business logic. Navigating is UI logic. I think this gets complicated. How do you handle like conditional UI logic? Um, that is the question, and I don't think they answered that. Um, I'd love to follow up with them. I think that's something that's missing from this particular page. But um, so I'm just pausing on this doc because it's making me question some things. It's not how I do things, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad recommendation, right? So it's giving me a chance to sort of self reflect and wonder like, am I always doing things the right way? Um, does it make sense to just have navigation code right inside the UI instead of passing it through the view model only for it to come right back? Like maybe that is overkill. Um, this is an interesting section though. That's pretty cool. That's also always been a long thing. Is like how do you handle user events inside recycler views? So we don't use recycler views in Compose, but I think the idea kind of applies and like specifically here, if the action is produced further down the UI tree, like in a recycler view item or a custom view. Um, yes, I typically do a lot of the ping pong stuff. I don't actually know if that's like that. Yeah, the analogy is great. Um, but this is a common concern. Like, okay, if I have a, you know, a profile button clicked, cool, I can handle that right at the screen. But think about our task list. Each task has like a reschedule button. Um, if I want to handle that click, but I want to know which item was clicked, how do I do that? And I think they're showing how we can do all that. So this is actually something we talked about earlier. Let's read through this. I think they're going to answer our question. For example, suppose that all news items from news activity contain a bookmark button. The view model needs to know the ID of the bookmarked news item. When the user bookmarks a news item, the recycler view adapter does not call the exposed add bookmark news ID function from the view model, which would require dependency on the view model. Instead, the view model exposes a state object called news item UI state, which contains the implementation for handling the event. Oh, this is interesting. So they create this news item UI state, which is kind of like the display model idea that we had. Instead of UI state, it's item UI state, it's display model, where they put all the information and then They put a listener on this class. Huh, interesting. Yeah, it sounds weird, but let's give it a try. Let's give it a try. Okay, well, this is already wrong. Hold on. Why are you depending on use cases and repositories? Be consistent here. But anyways, okay. So let's see what they do. So you have a new view model that has the format date use case and repository. So they do, okay, so this is close to what we had. So they get the latest news from the repository and then they call dot map and then they create a news item UI state. The use case, ooh, interesting. So rather than like what we had where we had um, they made a use case for formatting the date. Huh. I don't hate this part, but it's a little weird. But okay, so then business logic is passed as a Lambda function that the UI calls on click events. So on bookmark, we do repository.add bookmark. I'm now questioning myself, saying, okay, let's stare at this for a second because okay, so here's what I think is happening because I'm going through this too. My initial reaction is like, what the hell? Because I've never seen an approach like this. I've never written code like this in my life. However, what's the problem with it? Like, I mean, it's kind of nice because then I don't have the whole ping pong thing of like, um, you're right. So I don't think they should have like a designated thing on the like. Yeah, no, this is a use case. Wait, what was the question? The user adds a bookmark, not formatting. I'm not sure where you get confused. But like I'm looking at this and like what's wrong with it? Like in some ways this is actually going to reduce code because I won't really need to be like, view model.on bookmark clicked and then from there do a bunch of stuff. Like it'll just know like when reschedule is clicked, do a thing. So I kind of want to take this concept and try it out. Um, I want to just like write it. Let's write it out. That's what we do on this stream. We take ideas, we write them down and try them out. So, in order for me to properly do that, um, let's look at our task list view model real quick. Um, so I've got this get all task use case, right? Before I do that, let's hold on. Let's make another interface just so this compiles real quick for like let's call like reschedule task use case. Yes, Illustrator, I do the same thing. So let's try this out their way. So we'll make a rescheduled task use case. It'll have an operator fun and invoke. It'll take like a task ID, which is a string. And let's just do a result unit for now. Let's just have this so it compiles. How the data class equals and hash codes handle the lambda is it comparable? It is not. I'm pretty sure lambdas are not comparable. So I think the equals method would end up just comparing these properties. I think. Um, so that's a good question. Like, how do you? I don't know. That's a good question. If that would confuse tests or not, but um, so we would have that. Um, so now we can go here for now, and we could have like reschedule task use case. So we've updated our view model to have what we need. So let's go back to our display model. So now, something that we would no longer need a task ID, but we would have like on task clicked. That would just be, you know. And now my extension function here isn't really all that nice. Um, let's try it the Google way. Let's get rid of this extension function as well too. Um, let's get rid of that extension function as well too. And so we would just have a display model like this. And so in the view model, then here we would do the mapping. And so they put the date formatting into a use case, which is kind of cool. Um, Probably how I would actually do this now that I think about it. Um, if it doesn't look at it, this is could actually be pretty useful. Yeah. So then we'll do task display model. Um, Description will be it.description. Actually, let's put this in here. Let's do task. Scheduled date will be friendly date formatter. That format task that scheduled date. And then it's weird because you have to define the lambda where you map the model, and maybe your click listener isn't always going to your view model. Maybe. But I mean, I guess, isn't it? Like, isn't this view model responsible for. Yeah, exactly. Like, isn't this where I'm writing it? Exactly. Oh, and also that should be like on reschedule clicked. Um, oh, our task entity doesn't have like an ID. But if it did, it would go there. Oh, and then this is suspending function, so basically I have to like launch that. Okay, so that's what this would look like then. So the display model has the lambda on it. So here's where the mapping would go. I mean, we could still put this in like a private extension function or something, or just like a private function. Um, yeah, we could do like, oh, hold on. It would just be like map to display model. Um, okay. And then what would change about like our UI then? What happens if you want to save this UI state in a saved instance state though? I'm thinking about a click list that needs activities context, for example. You can't have context on the view model. Just thinking out loud. Yeah, that's a good point. Huh. But I guess like if you needed it to like, I don't know, pull like a string, then you could like inside the view you could pull the string and then you could pass it as like a lambda as an argument to this click lambda. But once we've done this while we're here, so then task list item, um, instead of on rescheduled clicked, instead of that, we would do task that on rescheduled clicked. Huh. Oh, this broke a whole bunch of shit. That's fine. Um, we don't have to worry about that for right now. But so then this is what the UI portion of the code would look like. Huh. Like I like it. This is less code overall. Like I want to finish this commit and find out how much code we actually have. Like how much we like what the diff would be. Let's do that if you guys don't mind indulging me anymore. Um, as display model. So then what else we need? Scheduled date. Oh my god. So that's fixed. Um, I guess we would need to go to like where we define the task list. So like this is gone. Um, we need display models here. I'm just like I have to update my compose previews, which probably affects like um, the like overall lines of code, so I'm not going to lose as many as I thought I was going to lose. But let's find out. So on rescheduled clicked is gone. Oh, this is also, this would be gone. We can deal with that later. Um, this is gone. Oh my god. Once again, we need to update these. Uh, that cleans up some code. Get rid of that for a sec. We would basically have to do the same thing for done. Wait, hold on. Why is this broken? Oh, right, that's gone. We removed done from here as well. I'm just having a night, Jens. Thanks for coming by. This will be on YouTube soon if you want to catch the parts that get missed. Um, I'm just removing done. I guess let's go all the way on this. Let's also have like on done clicked. So then on the task list item, we don't have this. We do task that on done clicked. So that gets removed from there. That gets an empty one. So that's good. We can remove it from the task list. 7 a.m. early riser. I guess here the line basically moves from here to here. Uh, in the content then, this is gone. And it goes there. So then on the screen, all this is gone. And then in the view model, where we map the display model, um, basically we don't have anything to put here, but we would put it there. 4 a.m. Oh my god. Thank you all for all of you who stay and watch this late at night. I really appreciate it. Um, but that is it. So let's recap that before we look at the get diff. So the recap was basically that our display model now has a click lambda on it. So like do this when reschedules click, do this when on done is clicked. And the person who defines that is our view model. When we receive the list of tasks and we map them to a display model, we define these lambdas that say, hey, call this use case, call that use case. Um, and then now we no longer have to deal with propagating the click up so many layers. And instead, it's just defined here once for this item. We need to do this thing. So if I commit here, will this show me? Can I view like the total diff? I feel like there's got to be a way. I just don't know how. In Android Studio. Does anyone know? I mean, I guess I could skim through to see, like, I mean, I added code there, and effectively, I guess really it's just I remove, commanding. Oh, I can move to changes, but I wanted to see if there was like what the diff is, like lines added versus lines removed. But I don't think I can see that. But I do think that overall this probably removes some code. So interesting. What are y'all's thoughts? Like getting over the initial hump that like I've never seen anything like this. Um, what do you think? Um, I'm like trying to find a reason why I don't like it, and I can't. Because like any initial reaction being like, oh, this data class isn't responsible for click listeners. But on the other hand, like if it's the display model, if it's the UI state of this list item, shouldn't it be responsible for the UI events? Um, you're right. So it does bring a good question on like persisting it. But okay, so here's my thoughts on that. Oh, right, this failed because I didn't make like an actual rescheduled task implementation. But okay, so so well, so here are my thoughts on the whole state change thing. One, we're using an architecture component view model, which is a retained thing. So this view state, even after things have been mapped, that is retained already. Um, so right, so like that's retained. We don't have to worry about it. The other hand is like the other point is like if I need to um right, so but could I have sort of like a so this gives me task entities, right? This part right here gives me task entities. These bare bones data classes that have parsable information. Could I not persist those domain models and then when we come back from process death, do this again? Um, like why not? Right? Especially because this is like a lambda that doesn't I mean it just depends on the view model being alive, right? It needs the view model's dependencies, it needs the task info, but could I not just do this mapping again when the view model is recreated? And like I don't know how I would do that. Honestly, I would just rely on the fact that the view model is retained. And like WebCheck said, like, so that's gonna just said, so that's gonna fix the majority of apps. But I guess if you needed it to be complicated, what you would do is you would persist, you would hold on to the text. But also in a truly, truly functional app, my tasks are going to be stored in like a database, and like even if I come back from process death, it's going to read them super quickly. So that's my thought, anyways. That is a good question. Um, yeah, interesting. Okay, I'm gonna sit with this. Maybe try it out. Maybe we merge this pull request. Um, I kind of wanna. If I do that, I need to make uh this branch path, but we'll do that later. So let's see what they have to say about this approach. So this way, the recycler view adapter only works with the data that it needs, the list of news item UI state objects. The adapter doesn't have access to the entire view model, making it less likely to abuse the functionality exposed by the view model. When you only allow the activity class to work with the view model, you separate responsibilities. This ensures that UI-specific objects like views or recycle view adapters don't interact directly with the view model. That's important. Our app, even though it wasn't using this paradigm, was already set up like that. That the individual list items had no idea that the view model happened or existed. Um, and then another warning. Yeah. Don't pass your view model to anything other than the screen that's using it. That's basically what this says. Oh, here we go. So, and this is what we had. Another common pattern is for the recycler view adapter to have a callback interface for user actions. In that case, the activity or fragment can handle the binding and call the view model functions directly from the callback interface. So this pattern is what we had previously, the composed version, and I think what a lot of people are used to doing. I've like never seen this other approach, but it's kind of nice. Um, I would love to like sit with it and try it out a little bit longer. So let's dive into the next section, naming conventions for user event functions. Here's what that's literally one thing. In this guide, the viewModel functions that handle user events are named with a verb based on the action that they handle. So for example, add bookmark or log in. Interesting. So this is telling me that my naming conventions are wrong. And they're not wrong, right? Because it's a guideline. But I don't do this. Um, what I like to do, well, you see, I use the old convention of like on this clicked. Um, so like here in the display model. So I use this convention of like on rescheduled clicked. But I think Google is oh, and they called it on bookmark here. So I wonder why they're saying so up here in their code they call it on bookmark, but then down here they're saying oh it should be add bookmark. I don't like the repository function should be add bookmark, yes. Oh, the view model functions that handle user events. Interesting. Agreed. Like I like what Raphael says. So what I mean by that is like login view model is a good one. So here, I type a function called login button clicked. I don't directly call it login because what if I can't log in? Right? Like it makes it sound like I'm logging in, but what if my credentials are wrong or whatever? So I like that it's just saying, hey, this thing was clicked. Now do stuff with that. That's my convention. I'm sticking to that. Um, all right, so this is the good part that we've all been waiting for. So UI actions that originate from the view model events, should always result in a UI state update. This complies with the principles of unidirectional data flow. It makes events reproducible after configuration changes, and guarantees that UI actions won't be lost. Optionally, you can also make events reproducible after process death if you use the save state module. Mapping UI actions to UI state is not always a simple process, but it does lead to simpler logic. Your thought process shouldn't end with determining how to make the UI navigate to a particular screen, for example. You need to think further and consider how to represent that user flow in your UI state. In other words, don't think about what actions the UI needs to make. Think about how those actions affect UI state. That's a lot. And this is now where it's challenging my way of doing things. Um, Especially the last part. This is like I've always been the opposite. I've always been thinking about like I need the UI to do something. How do I make it show a toast? How do I make it navigate? These are the questions I was asking. And they're saying that we should try not to think about it that way. We should try to think how do those actions affect UI state? And that's a really good message. So let's keep reading on. Feel like I'm about to have a breakthrough here. Key point, view model event should always result in the UI state update. Okay, for example, consider the case of navigating to the home screen when the user is logged in on the login screen. You could model this in the UI state as follows. So we have our login UI state. We have is loading, error message, is user logged in. The UI reacts, whoops, sorry. The UI reacts to changes to the is user logged in state and navigates to the correct destination as needed. So, okay, our view model has this UI state. This is weird. We don't do it that way, but whatever. So then the login screen has current on user login by remember updates. What does remember update state do? Okay, wait, so whenever the UI state changes, check if the user is logged in. So we do this launched effect based on the UI state, and we say if viewModel.UI state.is user logged in, current on user login. Huh. Okay, there's a lot going on here. I kind of get what they're saying. So instead of what we do, we let me show you what we do. Um, we have a channel because that's how I've seen this done in the past. We emit from this channel to say that login was completed, and then but they're saying no, you would have it as like part of the state. You would observe the state, and when that happens, we would call this. And Raphael brings up a good point. Like some things won't be matched; they're one-time things, like showing a toast error message. Let's see if they talk about that. Um, Maybe we could try this out as well, but let's keep going. Let's see what else they have to say before we shred the whole session, because we're not done. We've got more examples. I can see that this would work for login. I can see that this would work for a navigation scenario. Um, I would like to try this on our login screen. I can see that that would work, but let's go into more. So this is answers our question here. Consuming certain viewModel events in the UI might result in other UI state updates. For example, when showing transient messages on the screen to let the user know that something happened, the UI needs to notify the viewModel to trigger another state update when the message has been shown on the screen. So, okay, interesting. So we've got a user message that has like an ID and a message. And then we have a news UI state, which has a list of user messages. Interesting. Okay. The okay. We have a message to display, and our UI state has a list of messages. The view model would update the UI state as follows when the business logic requires showing a new transient message to the user. So, let's see. So in this example, if there's no internet connection, we add a new user message um, that says no internet connection, and we update our UI state. And then our view model has a new function saying, hey, this message was shown. And then it removes it from the list of messages. Okay. Okay. The view model doesn't need to know how the UI is showing the message on the screen. It just knows that there's a user message that needs to be shown. Once the transient message has been shown, the UI needs to notify the view model of that, causing another UI state update. So, let's see. So, UI state user messages first are null. So if we have a message, we trigger a launched effect. User message. Snack bar host state that show snack bar, and then we say that this was shown. Okay. Um so with navigating, yes, but kind of. Because once I navigate away, especially if I'm like popping up, especially if I pop, then I don't have to worry about it. But yeah, you would probably want to do it with navigating as well. To be like, we've done this. Um, but I do wonder if I don't know. Okay, if you think your UI event use case cannot be solved with the UI state updates, you might need to reconsider how data flows in your app. Consider the following principles. Each class should do what they're responsible for, not more. Okay. Think about where the event originates. We talked about that before. If you have multiple consumers and you're worried about an event being consumed multiple times, you might need to reconsider your architecture. All good notes here. I'm not reading the details here. Think about when state needs to be consumed. Um, oh, here we go. This is also, they're probably going to tell me that I did it wrong. In some apps, you may have seen view model events being exposed to the UI using Kotlin channels or other reactive streams. These solutions usually require workarounds, such as event wrappers, in order to guarantee that events are not lost and that they're only consumed once. Requiring workarounds is an indication that there's a problem with these approaches. The problem with exposing events from the view model is that it goes against the state down events up principle of unidirectional data flow. If you're in that situation, reconsider what that one-off view model event actually means for your UI and convert it to UI state. UI state better represents the UI at a given point in time. It gives you more delivery, and processing guarantees it's usually easier to test, and it integrates consistently with the rest of your app. All good points here. So now we can do another little case study of this, and let's refactor our login approach that we had previously. So I'm gonna commit what we did here because I gotta fix this branch, but um, what did we do here? Moving click listeners into display model. That was one thing we did here. And we're going to try to do this approach for navigating. So now you will re-add the source code lines you had removed. I don't I don't think any of the ones I did on this PR affect the navigation ones. Oh, me. But if the UI controls logic around toast being shown, then testing can become tricky. Um, yeah, I mean, kind of. If your view model, if your UI state just manages a list of items, you can test like what is or is not in that list. Oh, the quantity of lines. Yeah, no, but I'm going to switch to a new branch. I'm going to go back to development. And then from there, we're going to do login UI event handling. Okay, so let's talk about this first part. So I wonder what remember updated state does. I noticed that so they have on user login as like a function that's on their login screen, right? Um, but for our login screen, um, let's talk about how we do this. Um, we have this like side effect where we receive from the channel, then we call navigator.navigate. So let's comment all this out for a second. And let's think about how we would do this given um, what Android recommends. So I'm going to pull their code in as a comment just so I can like reference it in front of me. But basically what we could do is we could do launched effect on view state, right? Is that what I want? Um, that's a key. Oh, so it's basically saying as long as if this changes, the launched effect is triggered, I think is what that means. So if view state that value is login view state that completed, then we want to do this. We want to do navigator.navigate. So let me throw on wireless debugging real quick so we can actually test this. Um, but when we do, also I should look at my main activity and make sure that it actually um, I need to comment this out. Login screen is our start destination. And add test screen is not. This is from testing last week. Um, so I am curious because of the fact that we pop the login screen, um, if we have to worry about sort of not triggering this twice. Um, and actually, I like it might not because the state shouldn't trigger again. Oh no, this is running an emulator. I didn't mean for it to do that. That's fine. We can test on there too. We're just gonna have to wait a minute. But oh, so that's but so then with this, sorry, let's go a step further. So now we're listening for a state change, and based on that state change, we're triggering a UI event. So the other thing that means is that this channel doesn't matter. Um, so we can just get rid of all that code. And so we know when the result is success, we switch to view state that completed. Um, that seems fine. And we could try the like snack bar message idea with this sign up click thing and see if we like it. But in this particular case, we talked about this. Like, I just want to show a toast that like sign up hasn't been implemented yet, so we just leave that there. Um, Gradle's still running. This is not the current. No, this is not the current version. I don't think. Sorry, I meant for this to run on my phone. Not that it would have mattered. We'd still have to wait on the Gradle build, but we'll try that out. Um, so I like. So my thoughts on like Google's approach here with the sort of state the UI events. Um let's revisit this one line that they had. So they talked about, in other words, don't think about what actions the UI needs to make. Think about how those actions affect the UI state. I think in principle this idea makes sense because we talk about the UI state should represent what's on the screen. And that might represent that we've navigated or need to navigate. That might represent that we need to show a message to the user. These are things that do belong in our UI state. But historically, it's just been so complicated. Like, how do I take a UI state and show that something happened? And then how do I make sure it doesn't keep happening? And especially in the event of like a snack bar or a toast. And the way that a lot of us have done that is these reactive streams that I talked at the bottom. That's what I've done. That's what I kind of started to accept. Um, their idea of having like a message queue inside the UI state, like it's really clever. Um, and it makes sense that our UI state shows like here's the things that need to be displayed. And then once it's done, the UI says, "Hey, I did this," so you don't need to display it anymore. Like it makes sense. Like I learned something from this. I learned a new way of doing things that I actually really appreciate. Now, would I do it exactly the same way? I don't know. I mean, kind of. Like, I was a little confused why we had to have user message with like an ID and a message. And I think they just wanted like a unique way of referencing the ID. Um, why you could just have like a single string. I don't know. Maybe you want to show the same string multiple times. But like, I don't know. I am okay with that solution. Okay, here we ran this. So let's try some stuff out. So test, test. I really need to fix the UI here. So we log in. I didn't navigate. Huh. Why didn't I navigate? Did the launched effect not trigger? How did they have launched effect defined? They did it based on the UI state. Huh. I've got a breakpoint in here. Um, let's see how this goes. But so test. I gotta figure out the keyboard issues here. Like, is this not triggering? I wonder if maybe on the launched effect, maybe the view state as a key doesn't work out. Maybe I need to do view state that value is our key here. Let's try that. Okay, that navigated. Okay, so this worked. And then I pop this up. So if I press back, it closes. So let's, okay, let's commit this. So that up channel. So in this case, the channel was just like a unit, so we didn't drop a ton of, yeah, I've also used like channels or flows in the past as well. Um, but let's try, just for sake of argument, let's imagine we didn't pop the composable. So what I want to know is like if we log in and press back, does this launched effect trigger again? That's a good question. So we will find out. Um, and if it does, we can figure out how to avoid that. I don't think it will, because I'm in the completed state and I navigate away. Cool. Now if I go back, right, I'm still in the completed, but because this hasn't changed, um, yeah, it triggers only the first time. And that's because this hasn't changed. Since I navigated away and came back, like our view state hasn't changed, but it's possible that if our view state went from, well, the other thing is that completed is like an object. But I guess it's just something we would need to watch out for. That it's possible that our view state, um, that our launched effect triggers and we have like a duplicate event. It's just something to watch for. But in this case, no, it doesn't happen. So if we look at the code for that, actually, I guess that was a short one. So, okay, 3 change files with 5 additions and 18 deletions. So I removed code overall because I removed like all this channel logic, um, and made like the launched effect even cleaner. So that's kind of cool that we removed some code there. But yeah, I guess it's just important to consider like how, like if that could trigger more than once. Um, huh. All right. That was interesting. I learned something. So, and it's also a little after 9. So we might call the stream a little early today. Um, unless someone wants to do a deep dive into one of the specific layers, but we could, what we could do is we could, before I sign off, well, I'm kind of tired and I kind of want to sign off, but before I do, I'm going to open up each of these pages. And rather than do a deep dive into each layer, I'm going to read their sidebar like we were doing before. And I'm going to see if there's any specific topics that like we could learn about and talk about. So let's look at the UI layer page. Like, and this one, I definitely encourage everyone to check it out. Like, this is long. There's a lot going on here. Um, but I think there's, so they show like a basic case study of this. That's kind of cool. Um, talk about defining the UI state as data classes. I know they talk about the importance of immutability. Um, your state class should always have immutable vals. In progress operations, let's do it. I saw that as well. Okay, so a simple way to represent loading states is in a UI state class is with a Boolean field. The flag's value represents the presence or absence of a progress bar in the UI. Okay, we've kind of done stuff like this before. This shows like conditional UI and compose, where you basically do like if that Boolean is true, we show stuff. I imagine showing errors on the screen is sorry, I dropped stuff again. I imagine showing errors on the screen is the same idea. Um, oh, they show you how to do it with like stack pass. I noticed from here they kind of link to um, other link. Like they don't go into a deep dive on this topic, but they should. Um, their plans for making a server for this, maybe at some point. I definitely like want to have like some sort of backend implementation for this, or at least like a room database, if nothing else. But I haven't gotten there yet. Um, naming conventions. So their naming conventions, I like that they're consistent, but this is what we talked about before. So UI state classes are named based on the functionality of the screen or part of the screen they describe. The convention is as follows: functionality plus UI state. So this is similar to what I do, except like, so I have like a view state for the class. So we have like login view state, task list view state. I think if I wanted to be consistent, then I would have like task list item view state instead of display model, which I guess is just personal preference, but that's a good convention for them. But again, like people have patterns that they're comfortable with, those of us who've been doing this for a while, but really helpful for like new developers who are like, what do I call this? What do I make this? They know from this they can call it a UI state. I think it's really cool that they have those. Domain layer, oops. Um, dependencies. So we've talked about that. Usually has a dependency on the data layer. Um, and then I keep dropping stuff that I'm fidgeting with. And then it bothers me that it's on the floor. Let's see, what else we have? Call use cases in Kotlin. We already do that. We talked about how to do that. Threading. Oh, so this is an interesting. I saw this on Twitter too. Is it my engagement ring? No, no. I don't have a ring yet. I won't have one until we're married, which is not going to be for a long time, um, because everything is backed up right now. um, this is another question I've had. And I saw it on Twitter. Is so um, where do we do like threading? And this was the thing they said that confused people. Use cases from the domain layer must be main safe. In other words, they must be safe to call from the main thread. If these use cases perform long running blocking operations, they are responsible for moving that logic to the appropriate thread. However, before doing that, check if those blocking operations would be better placed in other layers of the hierarchy. Typically, complex computations happen in the data layer to encourage reusability or caching. For example, a resource intensive operation on a big list is better placed in the data layer than in the domain layer if the result needs to be cached to reuse it on multiple screens. The following example shows a use case that performs work on a background thread. So in the invoke they do with context, and then they take in the dispatcher. Um, I've seen this as like a, oh, that's cool. I'm gonna go star this and I'll check that out. Um, oh wait, no. Okay, I forked it instead of start it, but it'll remind me to go look at it. Um, yeah, so this is something I forget about a lot because, yeah, say something about threads. I forget about a lot because with a lot of the libraries we use out there, like Retrofit and Room, they kind of do this for us. So as an app developer, I often forget to change where I'm like the thread that I'm on because those libraries do it for me, you know. Um, wait to see what CP has to say before we move on. But I also don't know what dispatchers.default is. Why is it not dispatchers.io? Um, but no, this domain layer page looks good. It seems very similar to stuff we're already doing. Data layer is quite long too. I think um, I use default dispatcher in the view model, mapping the domain to UI model. Use cases does not change thread, just the suspend function, and the data layer on the IO dispatcher. And it's hella handy. Yeah, I think, and they hinted at that actually when they said like, um, typically it's your data layer that would need to worry about threading, and I think that makes sense. That's where you're doing your network calls. That's where you're doing your databases, your like file downloads and uploads. So the use case seems to be like it might just do some quick thing. Um, the thing is the default dispatcher in the vmail. Do you have any like right? The mapping could be a long list. So, uh, so let's switch to our other branch, and let's talk about that idea then. Oops. So, well, so one thing is we're already in the view model scope. We're already in a coroutine when I'm mapping these. So, but I guess it's technically happening. Is it technically happening on the main thread? I'm actually not sure what vmodelscope.launch does, if that takes you off the main thread or not. Oh, it is on the main thread still? Like, technically? Okay. So then, CP, what would you do? So let's say I'm in here. Um, oh yeah, especially because this map is definitely, or I don't know if this map is, yeah, I guess it is. So, so would you put that here? Like, and then, so then we're saying all of this is happening in the background? So, huh. So what is dispatchers.default? The default coroutine dispatcher that is used by all standard builders like launch, async, etc. Um, it is backed by a shared pool of threads on JVM. By default, the maximal level of parallelism used by this dispatcher is equal to the number of CPU cores, but it's at least two. So I've always seen people do like dispatchers.io. What's the difference between default and IO? Um, optimized for computations. Oh, right. Yeah, I forgot they were like, okay, interesting. So, and then do you typically like inject that? So, you could update it in your test. Um, so I've also seen this debate on Twitter where like you shouldn't need to override your dispatchers and tests unless you're passing the main dispatcher. But that otherwise things threading should still be testable. And I was like kind of confused by that. I feel like that's not true. But then, so for tests, would you just pass in like dispatchers.unconfined or whatever? I think that's what you would do. Um, we could try some tests for this actually. I think we have. Well, I made test code to dispatcher. Got it. These tests won't pass because of my little hilt issue, but um, actually, I guess we could try to fix that if we remove this. Uh, do I have testless view model tests? I do. Okay. Oh no. Uh, my tests are broken because of the swim model. So let's try. I want to try this out. I want to try to see if I can do some testing. Um, oh, this is gonna complicate things because the use case returns tasks and the view model returns on. Where does this fail? So I expect this will be interesting. So list of task display model, uh, scheduled date. Oh god. See, this is all right. Our tests are already going to be confusing because of the whole formatted date thing. So if I want to assert my view state, I'm going to have to consider the like scheduled date as part of it, um, and that would fail the thing. Um, so I'm not going to worry about getting the test passing, or should I just do it? We could just do it. Um, oh, actually, that's fine. So then here in the view model, we would say default dispatcher equals test code. Is that how you create it? Okay. Um, let's do a clean test. And I might have other compilation issues. Oh, right, I forgot about the control thing. Or wait, no, that's not it. I don't want to turn on dictation. I forgot what it was called. I'm just so used to using the terminal window in Android Studio at this point. But I also did a clean test, so that might take a second. So let's. Oh, and then data layer page. I didn't see anything in this sidebar that we needed to dive into. Craig Russell put out a great new article on testing coroutines. Ooh. Oh wow, this looks thorough. That's cool. I'll check this out. Oh, build failed. Probably some compilation thing. Oh, hold on. So this is because even though this is a default, Hilt doesn't know how to provide this. Um, is coroutine dispatcher an interface? It's an abstract class. So do I need to like uh hold on. What do we want? I need to put this in its own thing. Um, I don't know what to call this for now. Or like dispatcher. Have y'all done this before? Like where I basically need to hold on, let me read the error message again. So right. Coroutine's dispatcher cannot be provided without a provides annotated method. So and coroutine's dispatcher is you need a qualifier for each one. Yeah. Uh or I could just for the sake of right now add like one. Um but yeah, that's a good point. Then but here we could do so we do like provide default dispatcher and then Um, wait, no, it's provides, so I don't need to pass anything. We would just do coroutine dispatcher. So without worrying about a qualifier for each type of dispatcher, um, just to get this to compile for now. Oh yeah, I could do that. I have seen that approach as well, where instead of injecting an individual dispatcher, you have like a class that combines them all, and then you just uh, provide that one class. I've seen that approach, but I mostly just want to. I might not merge it as is, but I mostly just want to try this out after someone suggested it and see how how it looks. See if the test will pass. I wonder if I'm going to need like run blocking test on this or something. Yeah, I'm probably not gonna see a difference. So what would be, would you say that there is a difference? Got it. Okay. That's the difference, is I'm not using the main thread. But for, well, for my tests I'm not gonna see a difference. But I guess yeah, if I had a long running list of tasks, um, something like that would be nice. That's a really good suggestion. It failed, almost certainly because of the date formatting issue. But that could be another thing. I don't think we'll merge this code as it is. Um, unless y'all aren't tired yet and you want to fix that, in which case we could totally do that. Um, but no, I think I'll save that. But I think the solution is basically to do what Google did in one of their docs, which is inside this view model, wherever it is. So instead of having a hard-coded reference to a datetime formatter right here, what we would do is we would have our view model take in another use case for like formatting a date. Um, and then we would call that use case. And then in our tests, we can mock that use case response. And so we can ensure like in our tests, we get like the same scheduled date format no matter when our tests are run. And then we could have like a thorough test on our use case that actually validates like formatting a date, you know. Um, yeah, I think so. Let's do a quick recap. That was a really fun stream. So we got a chance to review the Android architecture docs. From there, we did a little comparison to our TOA application, which is pretty close to what the architecture docs already recommended. Um, we talked about a couple possible changes we could make to um, the sort of presentation logic, and maybe next time we can actually finish that PR and implement those. We also looked at how we could handle UI events a little better, changed our navigation on the login screen. Um, yeah, I learned I learned new things by going through this doc. Hopefully, some of y'all learned new things. Um, would you call that date format use case a use case? I mean, you could just use a mapper. I guess it's just convention, right? I guess it would depend on like what you were formatting it as. So imagine I want to do something like I want to return either today, like tomorrow, or the actual date. Um, I would make a use case for that, and I would call it like get relative day string use case or something. But I guess you could have like a datetime mapper class. I mean, in any case, right? It's gonna get passed into your view model. You're gonna have like, you know, relative day formatter use case, right? Being some use case. or yeah, or you're gonna have uh date time helper, you know, be some interface that gets passed in. So the general idea stays the same, and I think that the question just goes into personal preference and like semantics. Um, but the general concept is of having something injected into your view model that can take a date and format it. Whether you call it a use case, whether you make it like a simple mapper class, that's semantics, and I think up to you. Uh, Learning to code, thank you for the subscription. Um, that's fair. Formatting a date is not that. Um, so it could very well just be some sort of like helper class that gets injected in. That's totally valid. Um, yeah. Any before I rep, I'm gonna commit this real quick. Trying out default HTTP. I don't think I'm gonna merge this code, or if I do, we'll look at it again next week. Um, I will be here next week, but then after that, it's like the Christmas holiday, so next week will be the last one. Um, I would love to look at the accessibility scanner application. I did not get time to look at that tonight. Um, but yeah, thank you all for hanging out with this. I'll get this on YouTube soon. I think this will be a really cool YouTube video. Um, I think this conversation turned out great. I love that we got to review the docs, have conversations about them, take some ideas, and try them out in code. I know when new stuff comes out like this, I'm always super overwhelmed. I'll let you know if I try out the Lambda thing elsewhere. Um, I definitely want to try it actually in this app when we get further to actually supporting like rescheduling tasks. Um, but I know when stuff like this comes out, I always get super overwhelmed. So I like that I can use the stream both as a chance to force myself to learn it, but then other people can carve out time to try out new things. Otherwise, it just sits on our reading list forever. So um, it's okay. I understand. And then yeah, I'm like cautious about this saying this, but I am hoping that at the start of the new year we can add a second stream. That will be much earlier in the day. But that still needs to be finalized. So I'll let y'all post it. Thank you, Learning to Code for the subscription. Hallie Rootin for gifting 20 subs. I still can't believe that happened. Like every one of you has a sub badge in chat right now, which is amazing. I really need to get I think there was one other subscription too. We had some new followers. Uh thank you to all of you for the support for the channel. You are all amazing. Um yeah, I will see you next week. Let's